By the spring of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a cold, tense rhythm. A struggle measured not in battles, but in miles of ocean, gallons of fuel, and fragments of intercepted words. Guadalcanal had been won at last, but victory had come at a terrible cost. Every pilot, every sailor, every Marine knew that Japan still possessed a commander whose name carried both genius and dread. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategist who had once promised to run wild for 6 months across the Pacific. Those 6 months were over, yet Yamamoto still lived, and with him, the myth that Japan's navy remained untouchable. To the Americans who had watched the smoke of Pearl Harbor, his survival was a wound that refused to close. Far from the front lines, inside a nondescript building in Hawaii, the war was being fought in silence. At Station Hypo, rows of cryptanalysts bent over endless pages of numbers and kana symbols. They were linguists, mathematicians, and misfits, soldiers without weapons who killed with logic. One morning, a young lieutenant set down his pencil and looked up. "Sir, this one's different." The intercepted Japanese message carried a precision that made every analyst in the room go still. It detailed a flight schedule for an inspection tour, the departure and arrival times, the escort strength, the coordinates of landing fields. At the bottom of the page was a single name, Yamamoto. In Washington, the decoded message traveled swiftly up the chain of command. Navy intelligence called it the opportunity of the war, the chance to cut off the head of Japan's fleet. But there was danger in success. If Yamamoto were killed, Tokyo would know its codes had been broken. The Japanese would change everything. The question reached the highest office in America. Franklin D. Roosevelt listened, hands clasped behind his desk, and after a long pause said simply, "Get Yamamoto." The words moved through the Pacific like an electrical charge. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the order arrived to Major John W. Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron. 16 P-38 Lightnings were to take off before dawn, fly more than 400 miles over open water, twice their usual range, and intercept Yamamoto's aircraft somewhere over Bougainville. The men gathered in a bamboo hut for the briefing. Cigarette smoke curled through the air. A chalkboard listed altitudes and bearings that seemed impossible to memorize. The margin for error was measured in seconds. Mitchell's voice was calm but heavy. "We'll be flying lower than the mast of a destroyer. If you see the sun above the waves, you're too high. If you see spray, you're too low." A mechanic muttered, "That's a long way to go for one man." Someone else replied, "Not just a man." The twin-engined P-38 Lightning was the only American fighter capable of making the trip. Its long-range, counter-rotating propellers and heavy armament made it a predator unlike any other. Yet it had never been asked to fly a mission like this. A pinpoint strike across 1,000 miles of ocean, guided only by compass, stopwatch, and trust. As the tropical dusk faded, ground crews fueled the Lightnings to the brim, even filling their drop tanks with a few extra gallons beyond the safety line. The smell of aviation gasoline mingled with the scent of jungle rain. Some pilots wrote quick notes to families, others said nothing. They knew what one-way mission could mean. On the morning of April 18, 1943, before first light, the engines roared to life. The ground shook. The first P-38 rolled down the strip, wheels lifting just as dawn broke over the Solomon Sea. They flew at 50 feet above the water, in tight formation, invisible to radar, invisible to fate. For 2 hours they skimmed across the Pacific, guided only by the hands on a clock and the steadiness of their own nerves. Behind them, the island shrank into mist. Ahead of them lay an ocean, a line of coordinates, and a single man who believed himself untouchable. The narrator's voice lowers, deliberate and quiet. 16 men against the horizon, chasing a name, not yet knowing they were flying into legend. The Pacific at dawn was a mirror of light and silence. 16 aircraft streaked low across it, silver shapes cutting between sky and sea. The P-38 Lightnings flew in pairs, their props throwing thin spirals of mist behind them. Below, the ocean seemed close enough to touch, blue, endless, and merciless. Each pilot gripped his throttle tight. At 50 feet above the waves, there was no room for error. One mistake meant instant death. No radar, no radio chatter, only the steady growl of engines and the rhythm of the stopwatch taped to each man's knee. Inside the lead cockpit, Major John W. Mitchell checked his compass bearing for the 100th time. The flight plan was brutal. 400 miles to the target, 400 back. Almost 1,000 miles of open water. The Lightnings had been modified with long-range drop tanks. But even so, fuel would be measured to the last drop. The air smelled of salt and gasoline. The men's faces were streaked with sweat and sunlight. They knew that every minute spent alive was an equation. Range versus weight. Speed versus endurance. We hit the mark, one pilot thought, or we never come home. Far to the north, in the lush green of Rabaul and Bougainville, another man was beginning his day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, immaculate in his uniform, prepared for an inspection of forward bases. A show of confidence to restore morale after the defeat at Guadalcanal. His staff warned him that the Americans were growing bold, that the skies were no longer safe. He smiled faintly and replied, "A commander must share the same risks as his men." At exactly 6:00 a.m., Yamamoto boarded his Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. Its engines rumbled to life beside a second aircraft carrying his chief of staff. Overhead, 6-0 fighters circled protectively. To them, it was just another flight. They did not know the Americans already knew everything. The route, the time, even the shape of the Admiral's breakfast schedule. Back over the ocean, Mitchell's formation pushed north. Clouds began to gather, and for a moment, the horizon disappeared. The men flew blind. One aircraft dipped too low, its propeller biting the foam. Another rose too high and caught the glint of the rising sun. But discipline held. They flew in silence, like ghosts below the storm. It was the longest flight I ever made, one pilot would later say. Every second felt like an hour. After 2 hours and 20 minutes, the coastline of Bougainville appeared, dark, green, and steaming under the tropical heat. Mitchell glanced at his watch. The timing was perfect. The codebreakers had been right down to the minute. The mission's final phase began. The plan was elegant in its precision. 4 P-38s, led by Captain Thomas Lanfear, would climb high to cover against Japanese escorts. The remaining 12, under Mitchell and Lieutenant Rex Barber, would sweep in low, ambushing the Admiral's bombers during their descent to the airfield at Kahili. But precision is fragile. One missed bearing, one gust of wind, and the strike could miss its mark entirely. The pilots double-checked fuel levels. Dangerously low. They could not afford a second pass. Mitchell's voice came over the radio, calm but taut. "We're right on time. Prepare to intercept." The formation spread out, each Lightning slipping into its assigned vector. The tension in the cockpits was electric, a mix of fear, focus, and awe. Above them, unseen, Yamamoto's bombers were already approaching from the north, their shadows brushing the jungle canopy. At 9:34 a.m., the Americans spotted them. 2 Betty bombers, glinting in the sun, flanked by the sleek silhouettes of 6 Zeros. The hunters had found their prey. Mitchell's heart kicked once against his ribs. He keyed the radio. "Tally-ho, I see them." The Lightning split formation. Lanfear's high cover climbed toward the Zeros. Barber and his flight dove hard for the bombers below. The sky erupted. Engines screamed. Tracers streaked through cloud and sunlight. In seconds, the calm blue morning became a storm of fire and metal. The Japanese formation scattered, their tight discipline shattered by surprise. The Zeros clawed upward to meet the Americans head-on. Barber locked onto the lead bomber, Yamamoto's plane. He pushed his throttle forward, nose down, closing the distance. Back in the jungle, fishermen and soldiers looked up as the sky began to roar. 2 silver aircraft dropped from the clouds, chasing the dark shapes above them. The sound came first, the deep mechanical fury of warplanes in combat, followed by flashes of orange and white against the blue. In the next minute, history would tilt on the hinge of one man's aim. "This is it," Barber whispered to himself. The air over Bougainville was suddenly alive with fire. What had begun as calm blue sky now burned with the streaks of tracer rounds, twisting contrails, and the sharp metallic thunder of aerial combat. The Japanese formation broke apart in panic. 6 A6M Zeros, caught off guard, dove and climbed in frantic spirals. 2 lumbering Betty bombers, the Admiral's personal transport and its escort, banked hard toward the coastline, their green bodies gleaming in the sunlight. Below them, the American P-38 Lightnings came screaming upward out of the haze, each one a blade of silver light. Rex Barber's crosshairs locked onto the lead bomber, the one flying in the exact position the intelligence report had predicted Yamamoto would occupy. He squeezed the trigger. From 100 yards away, his 20mm cannon and 50 caliber machine guns spat flame. The rounds tore through the Betty's starboard engine, ripping open its fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. Its right wing erupted in smoke. Inside, Yamamoto's staff officer barely had time to look up. The cockpit filled with fire. The bomber lurched to the right, its engine screaming, then began to descend in a slow, spiraling fall. In the clear air above Bougainville, one of the most powerful men in the Japanese Empire was already dead. Narrator, quietly. For 2 years, he had commanded fleets and planned empires. His life ended in less than 10 seconds of gunfire. Barber broke away, banking sharply as debris tore past his canopy. Behind him, Captain Lanfear engaged the second Betty, slicing across its tail with a burst of gunfire. The bomber caught fire, trailing thick black smoke before plunging toward the jungle canopy below. The two Betty bombers, symbols of Yamamoto's power and pride, fell almost in unison. Flames blossomed among the palm trees like brief, terrible flowers. Above, the Zeros screamed into the fray, but the Americans were already in motion. Each P-38 twisting, diving, firing in pairs, breaking free before the enemy could regroup. For 10 minutes, the skies over Bougainville became a storm of chaos and precision. 16 American aircraft against 8 Japanese defenders. It was not a battle. It was a strike of surgical fury, executed with the precision of a clockwork plan. When it was over, the silence returned almost too quickly. The surviving P-38s regrouped over the water. Barber's voice came over the radio, tight and low. Both bombers confirmed down. Let's get out. There was no cheering, no triumph, just a shared, stunned understanding of what they had done. They turned south, throttling back to conserve the last of their fuel. The smell of cordite still hung in the cockpits. Hands trembled from adrenaline. Over the radio, one pilot murmured, "The Admiral won't be coming home." Below them, in the dense jungles of Bougainville, Japanese search parties found the wreckage hours later. The lead bomber had struck the forest canopy, leaving a blackened scar among the trees. Inside, they discovered the body of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still seated, one white-gloved hand gripping the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The Empire mourned in silence. Back in Rabaul, a coded message was sent to Tokyo. Yamamoto's plane failed to return. The Japanese government announced his death weeks later as a martyrdom. He died in the line of duty. But among his men, the loss was a wound beyond words. The architect of Japan's greatest victory had fallen to the quiet precision of American resolve. At 12:30 p.m., the first P-38s limped back toward Guadalcanal. Many were nearly out of fuel. One ran dry on final approach and crashed short of the runway. Ground crews ran to meet them, eyes wide. The pilots climbed out, wordless and pale, their uniforms drenched in sweat. They had flown 800 miles round trip. They had struck a single target, and they had changed the shape of the Pacific War. Mitchell said nothing when asked what happened over Bougainville. He simply nodded once and said, "Mission accomplished." That evening, as the tropical sun sank behind the ridges of Guadalcanal, the base loudspeakers played the daily bugle call. The sound drifted across the palm groves and the open sea where 16 men had vanished that morning, and 16 had returned, -1. The war would go on, but something had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. Oh, narrator. For a moment in April 1943, destiny took the shape of a silver plane flying low over a blue sea, and in its gun sight, the Empire's future burned. The 16 P-38s returned to Guadalcanal in silence. Their engines, once roaring with defiance, now hummed like distant thunder as each aircraft touched down on the coral strip. Ground crews rushed forward, counting them. 15. One had not made it back. Major Mitchell climbed from his cockpit, his legs unsteady, his face drawn by exhaustion and disbelief. Around him, the air smelled of oil, salt, and victory withheld. He had done what no one believed possible, but he could not speak of it. A staff officer met him at the edge of the field and handed him a single piece of paper. "Debrief is canceled. The mission is classified. You are to say nothing, ever." The operation's name, Vengeance, was now a secret lock tighter than the code that made it possible. In Washington, a message crossed the Pacific wires. Yamamoto confirmed deceased. There were no public celebrations, no headlines. The White House could not risk revealing that American codebreakers had penetrated Japan's communications network. If Tokyo realized the truth, they would change everything: the ciphers, the frequencies, the pattern of war. And so, the victory was buried. The pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron returned to routine missions. They received no medals, no citations, not even acknowledgement in official reports. For months, the world would believe Yamamoto had died in an ordinary accident. Narrator: it was the most successful secret of the Pacific War, so complete, even the victors could not speak of it. Across the ocean, Japan plunged into mourning. In Rabaul, Yamamoto's flag-draped coffin was carried to the pier, where sailors in white gloves saluted as the drums of mourning rolled across the harbor. His ashes were sent to Tokyo, his spirit enshrined at Yasukuni. For the first time, the Japanese people understood that even their most untouchable leader could fall. Morale dipped. Whispers spread through the ranks of the Imperial Navy. If Yamamoto was gone, who could lead them now? He had promised to die for the Emperor, one officer wrote. Now he has done it. The irony was bitter. The man who warned that war with America would be Japan's undoing had been undone by American persistence itself. Back on Guadalcanal, the men who had flown the mission resumed their duties as if nothing had happened. But at night, sitting on wooden crates beneath the wing of a Lightning, they spoke softly among themselves about the flight, the precision, the silence, the kill. They never called it revenge. They called it duty. Lieutenant Rex Barber wrote later, "We didn't hate the man. We hated what he represented. It was never personal. It was a message." When the war ended in 1945, Operation Vengeance finally became public. Newspapers printed grainy photographs of the wreckage in Bougainville. Headlines called it Justice for Pearl Harbor. But the men who had been there, Mitchell, Barber, Lanphier, and the others, were less certain. Fame brought arguments, claims over who fired the fatal shot, over credit that none of them had truly wanted. They understood something deeper, that history's sharpest moments are rarely clean. Narrator: they had flown through the eye of war itself, not for glory, but for precision, for calculation, for the invisible art of ending what others had begun. Decades later, Jungle reclaimed the crash site. The Betty's fuselage lay rusted and half-buried, vines winding through its broken ribs. Tourists and veterans alike would come to stand in silence there, the air thick with humidity and memory. One of the surviving pilots visited in the 1980s. Standing beside the twisted wreck, he said quietly to a local guide, "We didn't expect to come back. None of us thought we'd see home again." He paused, eyes tracing the canopy above. It's strange. You spend your life chasing one man across the sky, and in the end, you realize you were chasing the end of something much larger. The story of Operation Vengeance is not simply about retribution. It is about discipline, intelligence, and the fragile thread of timing that can change the course of a world war. 16 men had flown through 400 miles of open sea to intercept destiny. They returned carrying not trophies, but silence. Narrator, closing line, in April 1943, they hunted an admiral, but what they truly caught was proof that in war, the difference between vengeance and victory is measured only in minutes and in men.